Please open your Bibles to Leviticus chapter 13. Leviticus chapter 13. We open this morning in the Sinai Peninsula in the northeast corner of Egypt, where a group of Hebrew nomads have assembled at the foot of Mount Sinai. God has delivered them out of their slavery in Egypt, and they have assembled here awaiting a word from God. They have questions like, who are we? How did we come to be here? Where are we going? What will we do when we get there? Who is this God that's delivered us? What does He want from us in exchange for our freedom? Their leader Moses is up on top of the mountain. He's talking with God. He's been up there 6 weeks now. It's been almost 6 months since they left Egypt. And when Moses finally comes down after having spoken with God, he brings with him Leviticus, which to us might sound a bit anticlimactic. But to the people who first received it, this was a book that gave them direction and purpose and identity. And so for the last 7 weeks now, we've been combing through this book. We started by looking at the sacrifices for several weeks, the way in which the Israelites were made right with God, and the way in which they made amends with each other, and the way they celebrated the peace that they had with one another and with God. We looked at the priests who were the ones that oversaw this whole sacrificial system. We looked at animals, the clean and unclean animals that you were allowed to eat and which ones you were not allowed to eat. And we looked last week at discharges and childbirth, which was a very exciting lesson. And we looked at the importance of the physical body and our relationship with God. And today we come to chapters 13 and 14, which are two of the longest chapters in the Old Testament. They're not the two longest, but they are up there. These are some very long chapters, so we're not going to try to read everything, but we are going to talk about what these two chapters say and what they still have to say to us. So, Leviticus chapter 13, beginning in verse 1. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "If anyone has a swelling or a rash or discolored skin that might develop into a serious skin disease, that person must be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons. The priest will examine the affected area of the skin. If the hair in the affected area has turned white, and the problem appears to be more than skin deep, it is a serious skin disease, and the priest who examines it must pronounce that person ceremonially unclean. But if the affected area of the skin is only a white discoloration and does not appear to be more than skin deep, and if the hair on the spot has not turned white, the priest will quarantine the person for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest will make another examination. If he finds the affected area has not changed and the problem has not spread on the skin, the priest will quarantine the person for 7 more days. On the 7th day, the priest will make another examination. If he finds the affected area has faded and has not spread, the priest will pronounce the person ceremonially clean. It was only a rash. The person's clothing must be washed, and the person will be ceremonially clean. But if the rash continues to spread after the person has been examined by the priest and has been pronounced clean, the infected person must return to be examined again. If the priest finds that the rash has spread, he must pronounce the person ceremonially unclean, for it is indeed a skin disease. And all God's people said. What we see here, and really through the first 44 verses of Leviticus, is a cycle. We see the same 5 steps happening over and over. It begins with an indication that maybe there's something wrong with me. There's some sort of presentation of some kind of problem on my skin somewhere, whether it's on my head or my chin or my body. Somewhere I have presentation. There's an indication there might be a problem. A second thing is then I come for inspection. And the priest will inspect to see, is this really a serious skin disease? Is this not a skin disease? Is this just a rash? He's the one who's in charge of deciding if this is clean or unclean. And then he will, we have identifiers, things that were given to decide if it looks like this, then it's clean. If it looks like this, then it's unclean. And if it looks like this, then you would go to step 4, which is isolation. Put the person in quarantine for a week. Basically, you kick them out of the village and they live outside the city wall for a week, and then you come in for another inspection. And after they've been isolated, then it's finally time to interpret, is this clean or unclean? Time for the final verdict. So you take these 5 steps, this is what we saw in those first 8 verses, and basically you just rinse and repeat. And you see this several times in the first 44 verses. Now, there's some discussion as to exactly what these diseases may have been. Because sometimes they're red, sometimes they're white, sometimes the skin turns a little yellow, sometimes the hair fades, sometimes the hair turns white, So you have all these different criteria for a bunch of different presentations of this disease. And so people have thought, okay, well, what is this disease then? Some have suggested psoriasis is one, or eczema is one, ringworm, Hansen's disease. I mean, there are all kinds of skin things that people look at this and say, that's what it is. People have a field day trying to figure out what are all these issues in chapter 13. The problem is, ancient Hebrew, 3,500 years ago, they didn't have different words for all these different diseases. They only had one word. It was the word sara'at. Let me hear you say sara'at. Sara'at. It's a word that means infection or plague or contaminating fungus is probably the best way of thinking of it, because it's a word that they use not only for the skin, but also for your house or for your clothing. So mold, mildew, a rash, these are all called sara'at, fungus. So I think that's probably the best way to think of it, and then it presents itself in different ways with different kinds of criteria. Now, I said that it can present itself in places other than the skin. In chapter 13, we look at what happens when it contaminates clothing, skipping down to verse 47, I believe. Now suppose mildew contaminates some woolen or linen clothing, woolen or linen fabric, the hide of an animal, or anything made of leather. If the contaminated area in the clothing, the animal hide, the fabric, or the leather article has turned greenish or reddish, it is contaminated with mildew and must be shown to the priest. What we have is, again, the 5 steps. We have some sort of indication that there might be some kind of problem with my clothing. And then I go to the priest and have it inspected. And then perhaps he will isolate it. He has to identify, there are certain things that you would identify, is this clothing clean or unclean? And then finally he has to interpret, is this article clean or unclean? He has to interpret the evidence. So we see this in clothing, in fabric, but then we also see it in houses in chapter 14. So if you would turn with me in 14, beginning in verse 33. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when you arrive in Canaan, the land I am giving you as your own possession, I may contaminate some of the houses in your land with mildew. The owner of such a house must then go to the priest and say, it appears that my house has some kind of mildew. Before the priest goes in to inspect the house, he must have the house emptied, so nothing inside will be pronounced ceremonially unclean. There's a presentation of some kind of problem in the house. There's mold, there's mildew growing on the wall, there's a fungus that's infected the stones of my house. And so I call in the priest, and the priest has to inspect my house, and he has everything removed, and then he looks at the house to decide if everything, first he removes everything so that nothing will be pronounced unclean, and then he looks at this spot. The house is isolated in that everybody kind of leaves the house and you live somewhere else for a week. And there are certain criteria that have to be met to decide if it's clean or unclean, and the priest will then interpret it. So you have the same 5 steps, perhaps in a little different order, but it happens with people, it happens with clothing, it happens with houses. Now, they may not have had as big of a wardrobe as we have, but if they end up having to replace a piece of clothing, so be it. They don't have just a closet that's exploding with clothes. They only have a set, maybe 2 sets of clothes. But at the same time, if I have to get a new ephod, well, then I have to get a new ephod because the old one was unclean and we had to burn it. Okay, that's fine. I can replace it. I can scrounge up the cash to make that happen. Even if my house is contaminated and we have to remodel my house by knocking out that wall and rebuilding it with stones that don't have the fungus, we can do that. If we have to tear down the entire house and rebuild the entire house, it's not fun, it's not cheap, but it's possible. But consider what it meant for a person to be affected by Sara'at. Look in chapter 13, verse 45. Those who suffer from a serious skin disease must tear their clothing and leave their hair uncombed. They must cover their mouth and call out, "Unclean, unclean." As long as the serious disease lasts, they will be ceremonially unclean. They must live in isolation in their place outside the camp. You can imagine the young man. He's married, 3 kids. The oldest is in middle school. She's in a play coming up soon, the kind that has terrible lighting and scripts that have $50 royalties. The second child is in soccer on Saturdays and has karate on Tuesdays. And his youngest is starting school in the fall. And when the youngest goes off to school, his wife is thinking of going back to work, but really what she wants to have one more baby. He's advancing in his field, which is literally a field. He works for a landowner, taking care of an orchard, and there's a couple of acres of corn and barley. And one day he's out working, and his arm begins to itch, and he realizes he can't stop scratching. Well, that night he gets home, and he begins to get undressed, and he sees his whole arm is starting to turn red, and the hair is starting to fade a bit. And he knows what this means. And his wife knows what this means. And they're too scared to tell the kids. The next morning he goes to see the priest, who today is doubling as a social health worker. And the priest puts him in quarantine for a week. And he leaves the village, and he comes to the outside of the village, and he sees the outcasts, the others who have been rejected by society because of that spot on her face or that rash on his leg that won't go away. They are gaunt and their eyes are empty. And it is here that he spends the week, watching his arm get worse and worse. At the end of the week, the priest comes out to examine him and see, has the disease progressed? But he already knows what the diagnosis is going to be. The priest only confirms what he already knew. He won't be going to that terrible middle school play, and he won't be going to the soccer game on Saturday. When his wife comes out, or when his wife hears, her sister comes over to watch the kids, and she goes out to him, and his clothes are all tattered and torn, and his hair is greasy and matted and getting kind of nasty. And she comes to him for a kiss, and he backs away and covers his mouth and says, "Unclean." Fast forward a year, he still is on the outside of the village. He sleeps with his back against the city wall. His clothes are dingy and run down. His face is sunken in. His eyes are lifeless. His heart only beats out of obligation. And every day, as people leave the city to go out into the fields to work, and every day as they're coming back in 20, 40, 80 times a day, he covers his mouth and labels himself unclean. such is the life of anyone affected by Sara'at. There was a TV show not too long ago called Monk, which I was a big fan of. It was about a police consultant with obsessive-compulsive disorder. And one of these episodes centered around a man who had Hansen's disease, which is the modern name for leprosy, one of the particular manifestations of Sara'at. And the episode highlighted how people acted with such disdain and disgust and almost a fear of this man. Even though the disease now is totally treatable, it's been gone for years and years and years, the fact that he had it, people still kind of shun him. What is it about the image of a man in tattered clothes, hand over mouth saying, unclean, that is so enduring that a TV show 3,500 years later is highlighting how uncomfortable it makes us? Mary Ann Bird wrote in a memoir called The Whisper Test, "I grew up knowing I was different, and I hated it. I was born with a cleft palate, and when I started school, my classmates made it clear to me how I looked to others. A little girl with a misshapen lip, crooked nose, lopsided teeth, and garbled speech. When schoolmates asked, 'What happened to your lip?' I'd tell them I'd fallen and cut it on a piece of glass. Somehow, it seemed more acceptable to have suffered an accident than to have been born different. I was convinced that no one outside my family could love me. There was, however, a teacher in the second grade whom we all adored, Mrs. Leonard. She was short, round, happy, a sparkling lady. Annually, we had a hearing test. Mrs. Leonard gave the test to everyone in the class, and finally it was my turn. I knew from past years that as we stood against the door and covered one ear, the teacher sitting at the desk would whisper something, and we would have to repeat it back. Things like, 'The sky is blue,' or 'Do you have new shoes?' I waited there for those words that God must have put into her mouth, those 7 words that changed my life. Mrs. Leonard said in her whisper, 'I wish you were my little girl.'" What is it about the image of a man in tattered clothes, hand over mouth saying, unclean, that is so enduring? Perhaps it is that the ancient Hebrews were not the only ones with people on the outside of the village. Now, we'll go to the next slide. God provides a way for the person who is outside to come in. Chapters 13 and 14 of Leviticus offer this radical message. It was radical to the people that heard it, and really it's even still radical to us if we read it. Chapter 14, verse 1. "And the Lord said to Moses, 'The following instructions are for those seeking ceremonial purification from a skin disease. Those who have been healed must be brought to the priest, who will examine them at a place outside the camp. If the priest finds that someone has been healed of a serious skin disease, he will perform a purification ceremony using 2 live birds that are ceremonially clean, a stick of cedar, some scarlet yarn, and a hyssop branch. The priest will order that 1 bird be slaughtered over a clay pot filled with fresh water. He will take the live bird, the cedar stick, the scarlet yarn, and the hyssop branch, and dip them into the blood of the bird that was slaughtered over the fresh water. The priest will then sprinkle the blood of the dead bird 7 times on the person being purified of the skin disease. When the priest has purified the person, he will release the live bird into the open field to fly away. The persons being purified must then wash their clothes, shave off all their hair, and bathe themselves in water. Then they will be ceremonially clean and may return to the camp. However, they must remain outside their tents for 7 days. On the 7th day, they must again shave all the hair from their heads, including the hair of their beard and eyebrows. They must also wash their clothes and bathe themselves in water. Then they will be ceremonially clean. Chapters 13 and 14, though they are long and involved and sometimes runny and a bit splotchy, in their essence are a message of hope. Chapters 13 and 14 give the radical suggestion that the person on the outside can be restored. The person outside the village can be brought back in. And so to anyone who has ever been on the outside of the village, to the man who struggles to break into the communities at work because he's the new guy, to the girl who has a battle in trying to get recognition at school, to the mother who identifies better with her infant than with her peers, to the young man who has no sense of direction in his life and finds it difficult to find a community that he fits in, to anyone who has ever been an outsider, Leviticus 13 and 14 say there is hope to be restored. There is hope for those on the outside. The outsider can be brought in. The shunned can be accepted. The young man with no sense of direction can break in. Those who sleep outside the city can come home. So may you see those in your own village who are on the outside. May you put your trust in a God of new beginnings. And may you bring this hope to others.